First of all, I have to make a disclaimer. I'm not a music scholar, but I can only tell you what I've observed. Within my own roster of clients, the range is so broad as to be, close to infinite. The truth is, within the word, under the umbrella word of jazz, you can go from one side of the universe to the other musically, and I could give you examples where so many different kinds of music that would otherwise be given other labels are threaded in. And that's probably why, guys like us love the whole world of jazz, because it doesn't have that definition. It basically, it's the non-label. It's the non-labeled genre of music. It can be whatever that musician integrates, improvises, or thinks up on the spot. And that's not true of many other genres. One of the most remarkable experiences that I've seen was at Symphony Hall some years ago. We had Chick Corea and Gary Burton doing something. We did a project with the Boston, with the Handel and Haydn Society. And at the end of the concert, a group of the musicians just came up to Gary and Chick and basically said, "How do you do it? You didn't come out on stage with sheet music. And tonight, you played it a little different than you did last night. How'd you do that?" And that's what's marvelous about it. The answer to your question is, it's a word, and that's all it is. It doesn't have any finite definition, I don't think, other than to incorporate those elements I just referred to.
Questions? Down here.
If I may, I actually have two questions. Both thoughts I couldn't choose. We talk about creativity and innovation, and I think historically there was this association with freedom, and you referenced it. I wonder, as jazz has become international, kind of philosophical question, is there still that image of or association with freedom that pervades? Let me ask the second question and then listen for both answers. I was wondering, as you're talking about the economics of jazz, whether the in-person performance is the big source of revenue, particularly for up-and-coming jazz musicians. And the reason I'm asking is because I think that influences the question of how it is that the genre stays alive. So two very different questions.
Well, I'm going to let Ted speak to the revenue source balance.
Yeah.
He's more expert than I am on that. I think that jazz has always symbolized freedom, and we've touched on this several times already. There have been periods when freedom became a theme, if you will. Sonny Rollins, who we listened to, wrote a piece called The Freedom Suite in 1958 when he was unable to rent an apartment in a section of Manhattan because he was an African American. It was one of the first protest recordings. 2 years later, Max Roach wrote an entire album called the Freedom Now Suite that was inspired by the sit-ins that were taking place in the South. Mm-hmm. And I think that whole era became identified with this quest for freedom. But of course, 20 years earlier, Count Basie had recorded a song called Gone with What Wind. So there were comments being made all the time. And I think the example I gave of Czechoslovakia and the jazz section, Frank Zappa, who many of us don't think of as a jazz musician, but had a lot of improvisation in his music and had many more common points with jazz than a lot of pop musicians, was a hero in Czechoslovakia. And when Václav Havel assumed the presidency after the Iron Curtain fell, one of the first things he did was invite Frank Zappa to visit. And he was given a hero's welcome because that his music represented that kind of freedom. If you look at some of the books that were written in Eastern Bloc countries in the 60s and 70s, a Czech novelist named Dvoretsky, I believe, wrote one called The Bass Saxophone. And a great Soviet novelist, Aksionov, wrote a book called The Burn, where the major character is a jazz musician. Now, this just didn't take place in other countries. I think, I can't remember the character's name, but Thomas Pynchon's first novel has a main character based on Ornette Coleman. It was written in the early 1960s. So I think that, that the musician does symbolize the free spirit, the free soul, and free expression, and continues to, even if the theme isn't overtly in the music all the time.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking about the revenue sources for jazz musicians. The live performance component of their career is more and more the largest and most substantial part of what brings the money in. But you know, the positive, and this is what I like being a booking agent. I have clients who have been touring. Some of them have been touring for 50 years, and like I mentioned earlier, I don't have clients that can sell out the Boston Garden, but the jazz musicians have loyal audiences that stick with them. And over the course of a career, someone like Roy Haynes, who is 85 years old this year, he's going to have his busiest year ever this year. So there isn't always a high level of popularity. There's the exceptions. There's the Miles Davises and such. But the thing that is really interesting, many of the jazz musicians have very good, steady, long-term careers because there's such substance to what they do. It isn't frivolous. It isn't superficial. It isn't based on one-hit song. You know, Stan Getz, Dave Brubeck, and others, Herbie Hancock, they'll have their hit songs, but most jazz musicians never have a hit song. They just do something in general that really resonates with people, that has an identity, that has a voice that's unique to them. So when they come to town, if they like the way so-and-so plays saxophone, or they really like the way so-and-so plays keyboards, they'll buy a ticket to go hear that specific person, because that person has a musical identity and a voice that they have bought into.
Time for a couple more questions.
I grew up with swing, and then I went
You
to
bring
see
it
I
a little
can tell
closer to
that.
you.
I can tell that by looking at you.
And then I went to see Stan Kenton at Symphony Hall and played artistry and rhythm, and he had all kinds of Eddie Safransky and Maynard Ferguson and Shelly Manne. And from there I realized there were people like the Duke Ellington and Count Basie and Miles and Charlie Parker and Lester Young. And these people were not only musicians though, they were personalities. Everybody knew about Duke or Count or Sassy Sarah or Ella. And today, I must tell you the truth, I know that they're great, but they don't have that kind of persona. Would you discuss that, if you will?
Well, okay, it's simple. And this is true in blues as well. There were the founders. There's a certain group of musicians in the blues genre that were the giants. They were the founders. They really brought the genre up and exposed it. In jazz, there's not going to be another Miles Davis. There's not going to be another Sonny Rollins. But if there's good music and if the younger musicians find their voice, there's going to be a sustaining of the genre. But what you're kind of talking about, the word I use is the heroes. These were the real heroes of the genre. And they were there when it started and kind of evolved. And it's sad but true, but they're just, it's going to evolve. That's all I can tell you, I hope. And there will be, maybe not for you and me, but for my kids, there will be in their age demographic musicians who they discover early on in their lives, and they stick with them. And as they get older, they'll look back and say, "Oh yeah, that, yeah, what, he or she, that musician is one of the all-time greats. But you talk about going to Symphony Hall when you were young and younger, and you went to this concert, and there's musicians I grew up with, I started listening to when I was 8, 9 years old, and they're going to have a place that no one's going to ever replace.
Thank you.
So
Over here?
right next to you.
We'll come back to Ruth in a minute. Let's go over here.
I was wondering, can you hear me okay? Okay, I was wondering, I know that a lot of the independent artists now who are producing their own CDs, they, for a variety of reasons, don't have contracts with the major labels. They're putting their stuff out on the internet, and this is underground, undercurrent movement. I know that the R&B and the soul, that there are a lot of artists that are out there, and many of them are much more recognized overseas and in the Asian communities. I've started to see a few in the so-called new jazz, smooth jazz, contemporary jazz started to do that as well. Are you finding any younger people doing the same thing in regular jazz?
Oh, I think they have no choice. If you're a jazz musician, what's left of the major labels hasn't been interested in you for a long time anyway. Even the successful artists, and it would be interesting for you to think over your roster to see how many have left established labels to form their own companies, to do independent projects of that type. Sonny Rollins, who we've mentioned, and who's as recognizable and as successful as any artist in jazz, started his own record label 4 or 5 years ago.
But it's licensed to Universal.
But he still has to rely on big companies
I'm
to
talking about
distribute.
the ones who are not licensed to.
So you're talking about the more viral
Right,
type
I
of
know a lot
market.
of the younger people do it because they have much more ability to use the technology
Right.
themselves. So I didn't know if that same kind of thing is happening.
Oh, I think it is. There, an excellent bass player named Mark Elias, who's been a professional musician for about 30 years now. And he once made the comment, he said he put out his first album in 1982, and it was like publishing a book. And the last one he put out was like printing up a business card in comparison. And the technology makes that available, so what you find is more and more bands that are using MySpace and Facebook to inform their fan base about their appearances,
Yeah.
who are bringing, just like me, bringing their wares to market and making them available because they can't rely on traditional distribution. And beyond the Brookline Booksmiths and the Harvard bookstores, you can't rely on the big box bookstores to have the books you want or the recordings you want. So it really becomes a necessity, I think. And even if you have a major label deal, you still often find yourself marketing yourself in more creative ways, wouldn't you say?
Well, yeah, there's very few retail record stores now in the United States, as we all know. There's one chain still out in California, Peaches, I think. The irony is Mike Dries, who runs Newbury Comics, who's a good friend of mine, always thought of himself as a small, independent chain of record stores, and he always was, until the last few years. And now, I think a week ago, a friend of mine had dinner with him, and he said, "This is the irony of ironies." He says, "I now have one of the biggest record store chains in America. I'm one of the major retailers." So it's gotten to a point where your question, your hypothesis is correct. Most of our clients are either doing independent type of projects through websites like ArtistShare, or if we're doing deals with major labels, it's been about 2 years now. I've had a pretty strict policy for about 2 years. I don't do any deals with major record companies where they own the product, where they own the master recordings. I'll still do deals where they will license for a period of time the right to exploit the record, to sell it and market it. And I'm more than happy to utilize their publicity department and their marketing people and their distribution for the benefit of getting my clients' records out. But I've maintained a steadfast policy now. No longer do we do record deals with any label where they own the record. That's over.
The last question?
A couple of years ago, actually after this class, friends of mine and I went to Scholars based on a little clip we had seen in the Boston Globe in the G section to hear a young Japanese piano player called Hiromi.
Hiromi.
And did I say her name right?
Hiromi, yeah.
Yes. And I had never heard of her, and I'm not somebody that's very familiar with jazz, but it sounded interesting. And both sets were totally sold out. We were lucky to have gotten tickets. We went to the 10 o'clock performance on a Wednesday night. So I guess my question is, did I see somebody famous? Did I see an up-and-coming star? She was mesmerizing. And it was really a very exciting thing. The audience was very young at Scholars, and she was really delightful. So who did I see?
Well, Hiromi was a student at Berkeley, so she has a good following and is well known in the area. And by the way, she'll be back June 20 at the Berkeley Performance Center performing in Stanley Clark's band. Stanley was the bass player in Return to Forever, so you'll have another chance to see her. But she has a following, and it's building. She, as you know, she's interesting to watch. She's a good performer, and she is somebody that started out locally. I think in Japan, her first album sold hundreds of thousands of copies. She's very, very popular over there, and she's good. She's real good.
Well, when you ask if you saw someone famous, it's always relative. But I will point out that there are two major jazz magazines in the U.S., and Hiromi was on the cover of one of them a couple of months ago. So within that universe, she is famous.
Well, thank you all. You know what I've been so excited about in the open classroom is that we have people who come here who have a greater depth of knowledge about some of these topics, and I don't think we've had, in the 5 semesters we've done this, 2 speakers who knew more about their subject, Bob Blumenthal and Ted Kurland. Thanks everybody. I'm going to talk books of my own. This is one great book. Get it. Thanks for coming.